Very good morning to everyone. A special very good morning to our keynote speaker, the first keynote speaker, Kopano Ratele, and Signe Anfred. The tradition is that during the Nordic Africa Days, we have two keynotes, preferably from the two continents, meaning the Nordic region and the African continent. And now we've done just that. We also hope to be always gender balanced. We've done that too. That we have on both keynotes, we have both continents and both sexes represented. I'm Ina Sori, I'm the director of the Institute, and I will be your moderator during this session. We are going to run the session until 1:45, and I will try to provide as much as possible a space for discussion. So just for some house rules, when we start the discussion, be brief, present yourself. But at the same time, yeah, we hope that you are very active. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Kopano Ratele, who comes from the Rainbow Nation, Republic of South Africa. He works at the Institute of Social and Health Sciences at the University of South Africa, as it's known, UNISA. And he's also a researcher in the South African Medical Research Council of Violence, Injury and Peace Research. He has earlier been a professor at the University of Western Cape in the Department of Psychology and Women and Gender Studies. Kopano has published a very impressive list of works, books, scholarly essays, research papers, shorter pieces on psychological, cultural, social topics. And he's especially known for his work on men and masculinity in relation to violence, race, sexualities, and tradition. Books such as From Boys to Men, and There Was This Goat, maybe most well known of his publications. His latest publication, just out of the press of the South African Human Sciences and Research Council, is called Liberating Masculinities. In this book, Kopano argues that all masculinities are working models, and some models might be more unworkable given the prevailing structural conditions. Liberating Masculinities presents ways to understand the contestations around masculinity and gender relations. It offers both theoretically rich and psychologically insightful analysis to liberate men, as well as those who are involved in the making of men from oppressive and injurious models of masculinity. I'm sure Kopano will share some of the thoughts, further thoughts on that latest work of his. We have a discussant here, Associate Professor Signe Anfred from the University of Roskilde. Signe is our former researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute, and she actually ran a program of gender and sexuality for 6 years. So I actually blew her brain by presenting the topic of this Nordic Africa Days being gender and change. But there is a little anecdote that I have to share with you, because it has something to do with, most likely, at least unconsciously, why we chose this topic. Last year in Paris, the European Conference on African Studies was held, and we were all there. The other co-criminal is Elina Oinas, who is also our council member. Elina and Signe dragged me and Kopano to a restaurant in Paris, which is called Le Deux Magots. Does it ring a bell? Anybody? What is that restaurant known for? It's known for that it was frequented by the two very famous French philosophers, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. So I think the ladies, the feminist researchers, wanted to do a pilgrimage to go to this restaurant and, you know, have, I must say, overpriced food. I never had such an overcooked pasta with a, you know, I think it was even very overcooked cream with 30 euros. However, there we were, le deux Magot, and breathed the inspirations of the great French philosophers, and of course, we had all read our Second Sex, so we all, at least my generation of feminists, we know how impressive it was, the work of Simone de Beauvoir. So even though we did not discuss this year's Nordic Africa Days, let alone the topic for this year's Nordic Africa Days, it must have left something in me, right? Subconsciously. Now remember, Signe has been here for 6 years and we've never done a Nordic Africa Days on gender. Now, thanks to this, pilgrimage, here we are. So I'm also very happy that we managed to get Kopano here. You know, there's always a purpose for our social activities. So my final advice is, when you choose your restaurant here in Uppsala, let me know. Make sure that, you know, whatever you decide for the next Nordic Africa Days, you let me know in advance, because it might have very, you know, far-reaching consequences. Thank you very much. Now I call upon Professor Ratele.
Good morning, all. It was a distinct pleasure to have received the invitation to be part of the Nordic Africa Days 2016. My satisfaction partly is due to the fact that 13 years ago, when I was a lot less gray and much more optimistic about revolutionary social and cultural change, as distinct from political change, I spent a fondly remembered 3 months as a guest researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute. And those pictures are by Maya Pambeck, right there. As you can see, my beard is still black right there. In part, I find it uniquely striking to have a Europe-based institute, as Ina has already said, to dedicate an entire conference to gender in Africa. In this light, I wish to heartily thank Signe Anfred and Barney Pitjana, who suggested that I might be a good person to have, and Ina Sawyer and all at the Nordic Africa Institute for inviting me, and especially Tanya Bagger for making the arrangements as painless as possible. For some time now, I have been thinking about not just men and men's genders and within tradition, but also social and cultural change, how we might think men in the context of tradition. So I proposed, and I will talk for the next 35 minutes or so on masculinities and tradition. A third term, men's sexualities, is introduced to anchor my working through of the relationship between these two terms. An argument I make, which I've made for some time now, including in the book that just came out, and you can find a chapter in the book and in Amanda Hose's book. The argument is that intersex, trans, bisexual, gay, queer, lesbian, and other sexually and gender non-conforming Africans, of course, have as much of a claim to the self-avowed traditions as any other African gender and sexual conformist. In another way, what is often erroneously called traditional, but better conceived as traditionalist African masculinities, have no more claim to African traditions than, if you will, non-traditionalist masculinities. This claim will always be contested, sometimes violently so. Tradition alludes to desire for connectedness, and situates the self in the flow of time. If one has ever desired a wedding, or thought how to bury a loved one, or considered a name change after marriage, one is already positioned in relation to tradition. Usually advanced under various names, tradition not only is constitutive of our social worlds, but is a basic resource in self-making. That is, we are all traditional in one way or another. A set of usually tacit assumptions that frame our engagement with, for example, our bodies, our personhood, our beliefs, our practices, and thus also with others. Tradition does not always advertise itself unless it comes under challenge. Yet it is precisely when a practice like a heterosexual marriage between two subjects does not broadcast itself as an expression of a tradition that it is most powerful. As a discursive resource to negotiate such matters as home, tradition is characterized by issues about the meaning of a social past in relation to the present, of the meaning of historical social membership, of interpretation in the context of group life. Particularly significant in thinking of tradition is the problem of authority. For example, regarding who decides what is tradition and what is not, or who can say who belongs, or who can permit newness. So the major problematic is that authority within tradition is entangled with processes of heteropatriarchalization. So whereas the hand of tradition may be readily perceptible during key cultural life moments such as weddings and funerals, then tradition is never too far off in discussions of the everyday life of gender and sexualities. But given the particularities of the interrupted histories in post-colonial contexts, of the densities of competing forces, multiple temporalities, and contestations of social and psychical life within some cultures more than others, a claim to be recognized, a claim for recognition of a historically marginalized group in former colonies could never not attract resistance, can never not generate intense dissensus. As such, although all African genders, men, women, and other genders, do have a claim, a legitimate claim for belonging within a self-avowed tradition, any attempt to try to change gender and sexual relations in historically, particularly in historically colonized or among the marginalized group, is likely to meet even greater resistance if it does not work through the question of how to understand and how to change tradition. In working through this question then of how masculinities and men's sexualities contest, seek to become, and are resisted by others from becoming part of a tradition, I draw on critical studies of men and masculinities. My hope is to illuminate in the minutes I have a way through work on African men and masculinities that appear to render near impossible a reading of African men's practices on their own terms, in their own meaningfulness, in their own embeddedness in a culture, in the flow of a living tradition. I employ the case of a famous quote-unquote traditional gay wedding that took place in Kwatuguza, a relatively small township in KwaZulu-Natal province on the east coast of South Africa, as well as the mediated response to the wedding, to consider how we might better understand the relation of gender, sexualities, and tradition. Kwatuguza may not be well known to some of you. However, South Africa is the site of one of the most intense oppressions and dense struggles of the 20th century should be familiar to many of you at this conference. As such, it is not necessary to give a history of and contemporary developments in the country, although they can be so absorbing. However, there are some details that might not be readily known by and in need of underlining if we're fully to understand the current and often volatile contestations around masculinities, around gender relations, as well as men's and women's and other gender sexualities in that country. One momentous change has been the shift from a legal, political context within which sex and marriage between persons from different racial groups was prohibited, to where not only interracial marriages are permissible since 1996, but also where the same sex, same gender subjects of the same or different race can marry or have a civil union. Another equally pertinent change has been the introduction of a number of laws around the governance of tradition and customary marriage, namely the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act and the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act. A more pertinent change is that whereas apartheid laws frame masculinities and sexualities within a heteronormative framework, the post-apartheid democratic constitution guarantees and protects the right of sexual orientation. All of these laws and policies have shifted the grounds on which sexual and gender relations and expressions can occur, as well as signaling to an obvious need to do more work to understand the meanings of the shifts and the contestations around gender, sexualities, and tradition as they interpenetrate each other. I want to present to you something about the wedding and the comments on the wedding video captured by the South African news channel ENCA, and then I want to make some brief remarks about masculinities, men's sexualities and traditions, drawing attention to the complex yet often neglected relationship between masculinities and men's sexualities to tradition within critical masculinity studies. In the final few minutes, I'll reflect on the implication of the claim of the gay couple to tradition and some of the resistance from gender and sexual traditionalism. 3 years ago, two young men, both 27 at the time, audit manager Tsepo Cameron Mudisani and IT specialist Toba Calvin Sitole got married in a ceremony before 200 guests in Kwatuguza, near Stenga. You can see it on the map. While the two men work and live in the first world-like Sandton city in Gauteng, one of the 9 provinces of South Africa. One of the couple hails from Kwatuguza, where then they return to get married. I note this to suggest that the term home always signals an ongoing need to think further on geographies of masculinities and sexualities in relation to culture and tradition. People's constructions of this thing called home, which are mediated by social identity and relationships, are based on emotional attachments to a space. Claims about belonging to a tradition, which are claims to a cultural home, are about affective, embodied identification with the place, with the people. As is usually done in traditional heterosexual marriages, a cow was sacrificed to honor amadlozi, the ancestors. The couple introduced themselves to their ancestors and asked for blessings. The traditional umabo, just gift-giving ceremony connected to the beginnings of a marriage, was performed. The activist, writer, documentary filmmaker Zethu Matebeni makes an interesting observation about this. In African tradition, she says, or a combination of African tradition with elements of Western tradition, the marriage ceremony would usually be a lengthy process involving both families, negotiating lobola, bride wealth, organizing a church service, perhaps, or an equivalent service in some other space, and then slaughtering of animals. The whole community would bear witness. What Matebeni is suggesting is that for same-sex ceremonies, tradition may not be a part of the solemnization. This is perhaps the key issue that renders the wedding of the two men noteworthy. They wanted to obey tradition. They wanted to involve families. They wanted the community to bear witness. This was referred to as the first traditional gay wedding, a very interesting phrase in itself. The ceremony was covered by an ENC, as I said, with the other global networks following, making it possible for the story and visuals to be accessed around the world. The news video clip of the broadcast from NCA, which is available on the web, inspired a huge debate. Many commentators were supportive of the wedding, but many others were against. Even the royal house, which I will come back to, even the royal house of the Zulus felt driven to comment on the wedding in the media. So this was an important moment. The Sithole Modisanis, both changed their surnames, have become famous or infamous, at once disparaged and celebrated. Media stories have been written and produced about their wedding, about their love, about their identities. They were favorably used by the African National Congress, the ruling party in South Africa, in its campaign during the 2014 national and provincial elections. So let me put a selection of comments on the wedding relevant to the question of tradition. The idea is not to take an analysis of the comments, but to give an illustration of the debate generated by the wedding with specific reference to those comments that mention and gesture towards tradition, towards customs, towards Zuluness, towards Africanness, towards culture, as they link up with sexualities and gender. The comments are extracted from the YouTube channel of the ENCA News, and except for spacing, I hope you can see that. Except for spacing, I've put them up, I've just put them up on the slide as they appear on the webpage, including all the ungrammatical mistakes, editorial mistakes, and the name of the author. I'm not going to spend any time. You can please read it so that I can keep to my time. What I want to draw from this is from the comments and debate on the wedding, it would seem the Sithole Modisani became a screen in psychoanalytic terms, a screen on which not just Africans, but other subjects, Europeans, Americans, other subjects from around the world projected their views on what is African tradition, on what is African culture, on Zuluness, on race, as one of intertwined concern, and then love, marriage, gender, and sexuality as another set of concerns. I should note that yesterday morning, the video clip on the wedding of Sithole Modisanis, which you can access at your leisure on YouTube, as I said, by simply typing gay wedding tradition Africa, has been viewed more than 1 million times and had been commented on over 3,000 times. If you are a Twitterati, you want your tweet to be commented 3,000 times. Or of interest is that at the time of the wedding, the Modisani was already aware of the import of the moment. Among other things, he stated that they were making history here. He also said, I love Toba so much, I think, as I've mentioned before, it is against this idea that being gay is un-African. Being gay is as African as being black. We are part of our culture. We are rooted in our culture. So he's making a claim to tradition, to culture. In another news report, Sithole said, we communicated our intentions to get married to both our families as we wanted to have a traditional African ceremony and also have a traditional Western fairy tale white wedding. And I like that he used traditional in both senses. This is a point I'm trying to make. He used it in relation to African traditions and in relation to the West. So before I return to the claim on culture and tradition that the Sitholes Modisanis were making in getting married thus, I want to turn to some literature. I can't spend a lot of time on masculinities, on men's sexualities and traditions. It would be impossible, that's why I'm not spending a lot of time. It would be impossible to give an exhaustive review of the pertinent different bodies of literature on masculinities, on men's sexualities, and on tradition. And because the literature on each one of these is vast. For instance, works on African masculinities has burgeoned since the 1990s. But in the context of the global work on men and masculinities, it is quite limited. At the beginning of this month, for instance, September 4, when I checked it, a simple Google scholar search for masculinities, masculinity and masculinities, returned 703,000 and 112,000 hits respectively. And for the exact phrase, African masculinity, African masculinities, you get 762 and 834 hits respectively. Last year, when I checked around the same time, as you can see, I play on Google quite a lot. Searching for the exact phrases, African masculinity and African masculinities, returned 540 and 628 respectively. What I'm trying to trace is this growth of this literature. It's a simple search, and in all cases, it leaves out many, many works. It will be plain that I am interested in the world economy of knowledge production on men and masculinities, but I all I wish to signal is that the scope and differences in the literature and how difficult it would be to do justice in a short time. However, let me make a few brief remarks about each of these literatures here. Let me start with studies of men and masculinities. Work drawing on constructionist, critical or feminist studies on men and masculinities has expanded to most parts of the world and reached nearly all of the humanities and social sciences. Among the key contributions of gender analysis from masculinity studies is the currently widely accepted view that masculinities are culturally constructed, and instead of one single masculinity, there are plural masculinities. It differs from place to place. It is historically contingent. It's located within intersecting social divisions. It's co-constituted with other social practices, and it is centrally defined by power. Masculinities are not only biological, though the body is key in the expressions of gender and sexualities. They're not a fixed set of roles or role expectations, although cultures expect those identified as men, boys, women, and girls, and other genders to behave in particular ways. Although men and sometimes women identify with particular masculinities, masculinities are not simply subjective identities. Primarily, they are about social relations, characterized by power. So then, even whilst debates continue on the utility of concepts such as masculinity, as well as hegemonic masculinity, as opposed, for instance, focusing on men's discursive material practices or hegemonic men, as Jeff Hahn has insisted, masculinity and hegemonic masculinity have been central in widening the analysis on men's genders and sexualities. Turning to sexualities in studies of men. Sexualities have been a key topic in the turn to masculinities. Peter Jackson, a while back, once said that work on men and masculinities was preoccupied, perhaps like men themselves, with male sexuality, rather than addressing inequalities between men and women in political and economic life. Whether or not this is so or remains the case, scholarship on men has made significant contributions toward a critical understanding of sexualities. A point to be borne in mind in reading the case that I have talking about of the Sithole Modisaneng is one about traditional marriage, quote unquote, and its presumed contradiction to homosexuality is made by Raewyn Cornell. She says, the most important feature of contemporary hegemonic masculinity is that it is heterosexual, being closely connected to the institution of marriage. And a key form of subordinated masculinity is homosexual. An equally productive observation is made by Tim Edwards. And it is that the prominent feature of the queer man is that he eroticizes other men. This eroticization by other men and the non-eroticization of women can be very troubling for some non-queer men. The antipathy against sexually non-conforming men and women thus partly arises from this psychosocial and political disturbance generated in heterosexual men by queer desire. I want to suggest that while researchers have been conducting some informative work on men and masculinities, specifically in relation to male sexualities, some intriguing and context-bound, some time-bound and context-bound problems have not received adequate attention. And this is work that I've been doing trying to show this. For instance, I find that there is a scarce examination of questions such as under what circumstances, under what social conditions, under what political conditions might queer sexualities and queer marriage become widely accepted within a place. I'm signaling a question that arises in the context of rapid social, political, economic, and technological changes across particularly African countries, but I would say all changing societies, changes that have intensified contestations around gender and sexualities generally, and specifically queer genders, sexualities, bodies, feelings, practices, and relations. The changes, such changes, these changes have speeded up cultural change and heightened discordancy about the meanings of cultural traditions. In these changing contexts then, an issue that I always think could use some research and theoretical attention is precisely the question of how men, masculinities, and male sexualities particularly, or as illustrated by gay sex and marriage, come to be and why they are resisted from being part of cultural traditions. And now last, about tradition in studies of masculinities. Tradition has a queer, if I could use that word, by meaning a curious, right? A curious and under-theorized place in studies of masculinities. Although it is often mentioned in gender studies as well, in feminist studies, the word tradition is always mentioned. It is less common to find work that is explicit as to what precisely is tradition about. For instance, traditional masculinity, that's the word that often used, or traditional femininity, or traditional gender roles. So what some of studies on traditional masculinities, largely found in US psychology, have done is measure traditional masculinity, meaning the assumption that you can measure this thing called traditional masculinities. And so it turns it into a personality trait. That said, critical masculinities have observed, some oblique observations, such as that in the absence of violence, traditional norms underpin men's relationship to and oppressive practices over women, children, and marginal men. These observations about traditional norms are worth noting in studying and thinking about men and men's sexualities in relation to tradition. However, some of the pro-feminist criticism of traditional normativities suffer serious inadequacies, particularly when such criticism sneaks in a view about the inferiority of others' traditions when compared to how we live, which is supposedly not traditional. And there are several infelicitous consequences of constructing tradition as something out there, as a personality trait. Instead, the way I see it, tradition is something we all do, as I've said already. It is something that we do, or positions we take within social interactions. One of these is that tradition gets to be what some men and some women have, particularly Africans. They have traditions, we don't have traditions. Another is that in places where struggles against North American and West European heteropatriarchal cultural hegemony, but also struggles against African heteropatriarchy, are most intense, you have to do two things. You have to fight on two fronts. This becomes necessary if you are going to try to develop a nuanced theoretical explanation and political activism that responds to coloniality-infused criticism of tradition. On the one hand, on the one battlefront, and on the other, you're fighting this gender and sexual traditionalism that characterizes many traditions in Africa, but also, as I say, around the world. So as regards gender, for instance, on the one hand, you have to do work, you have to do political work, social activist work, and research, and theory making. That shows when and for what purpose men and women might take recourse in the discourse of tradition. On the other, you still have to undertake empowering work, feminist work that affirms non-conforming gender practices as belonging within African traditions. So how might we better understand tradition in masculinity studies then? Even though it is highly elusive and a contentious concept, there are several commonly accepted meanings of tradition. And besides words like custom and ritual, the word is often equated with words such as convention, custom, common law, heritage, and so on. There are, however, crucial ways in which tradition goes beyond something like convention. For one thing, tradition accretes symbolic function. However, the function of tradition extends beyond the symbolic to the constitution of all of our social worlds and the making of the self, to homemaking, to group identity, and self-construction, as I've said. The principal meaning of tradition in contemporary times is this. It's the action of handing down beliefs, etc., from generation to generation. So all teaching, for instance, is tradition, because you're handing down a body of work, a body of thinking. And related meanings, closely related meanings of tradition refer to accepted beliefs, thought to be from time immemorial, an inherited way of doing things. So these meanings are a start in reflecting on tradition. However, they don't give any clue. If you want to, for instance, if you wish to know with regard to sexualities, when do sexualities become traditional? Why do people turn to tradition? All we are able to say from them is that, as with other social practices, sexualities might become tradition when they get transmitted from generation to tradition. This does not take us too far, of course. If you're thinking like that, you have to do something else, since only selected practices about gender and sexuality are handed down between generations. What sorts of beliefs, practices, etc., then get conveyed from one generation to another? Tradition, as I've suggested, has to be understood as indicating our experiences, all of our experiences, and identities, and how we account for this in the context of life with others, and against the way a more or less collective past is authorized, is interpreted and authorized. It refers to the selective interpretive work through which authority is conferred upon the continuity of experience and identification. Of course, traditions are constantly invented and reinvented, as Hobsbawm said a while back. They're always contested. They change over time, as well as shape and are shaped by how and where we live. However, an important note is that a version of tradition is always in play when we speak, one might say, about ourselves as members of a group from somewhere, meaning a place and a time, a home. The notion of tradition as a resource from which ideas for dealing with contemporary situations can be drawn, Andrew Spiegel has said, is crucial in that it directs one's attention towards analysis of those situations where the process of cultural transmission is actively pursued. So in talking tradition and in thinking about when people talk tradition, you have to think about people gesturing to a form of social thought and an action defined by what Joseph Soares stated, the self-conscious extent to which they are aware of themselves as deliberately attempting to act with an ethic of responsibility to the past as well as to the future. Now let me return in the last 5 minutes to the Modisani. What seems to be enthralling for others and disconcerting for some about this event has more to do with contestations about and within tradition, a contest that pits a dominant gender and sexual traditionalism against subjugated experiences and expressions of gender and sexuality. By gender and sexual tradition, let me define this at this point. I mean a discourse about tradition whose primary goal is to maintain the power of a gender, of sexually conforming men and women, a position within tradition which employs and which seeks to re-tribalize genders and sexualities of all boys, men, girls, and women. Historically, heterosexual marriage, whether in monogamous or polygamous cultures, has had a key role in the reproduction of gender and sexual traditionalism. An issue I now wish to draw your attention is that of a situational and specifically geographic context of sexual and gender life. As I've said, the wedding took place in KwaTuguza, in a township in KwaZulu, the township in KwaZulu-Natal province. The importance of place in construction and contestations around men's sexualities and masculinities is visible in reading several of the web-mediated comments that about Africa, about Europe, about specific countries and land. However, the significance of KwaTuguza as a particular place tied to particular ideas of masculinity and sexuality was most visible in the objections in the traditional media, not on the web, from the royal house of the Zulus. Speaking on behalf of the king of the Zulus, a spokesperson said the news of the event and where it took place, KwaTuguza, which is one of the, I quote, respected places of the Zulus, was shocking. The objection cues a potentially interesting element in understanding not only tradition but also geographies of masculinities and queer sexualities. The cultural and emotional significance of place in identity making and understanding discourses around gender and sexualities too. Perhaps we might speculate the Zulu royal house might have ignored the traditional gay ceremony if it was not performed in KwaTuguza but in Sentin. And I suspect it would have. So place, because it's home, is where you want to do an intervention and thinking about that. Generally, the event is disturbing for gender and sexual traditionalism as it fights to hold on to the power to authorize how masculinities and femininities, or sexualities, relationships, and traditions are constructed and expressed. Gay masculinities, similar to lesbian, bisexual, transmasculine, and transfeminine, queer, and intersex sexualities, and gender practices, especially in small towns, in villages, in townships, in rural South Africa, present a potentially, but not always radical challenge to the traditionally sexual masculine order. I could talk about this during question time, but I mean, it's potential, but not always so, because you're fitting yourself in the existing framework of thinking about tradition. It is also important to note that the claim of the couple for their sexualities and manhood to be recognized as belonging to their culture, and the resistance to that claim occurs in the context in which black South African tradition are still grappling to define themselves beyond colonial and apartheid categorizations. Under colonialism and apartheid, conservative, heteropatriarchal African traditions were appropriated by the colonizers and nationalists as a key apparatus to rationalize domination. The meaning of black traditions is therefore always already highly troubled. The wedding can thus be read as a claim that African tradition is not one static thing, but rather an emergent, shifting category that is co-constitutive of different forms of changing masculinities and sexualities. Now, although their act has been mainly accounted for in terms of non-heteronormative sexualities, a point I'm trying to underline is that, as Mudisani declared, they were also making a claim on culture, a claim on tradition. And I'm saying this is much harder work to do. This is the work that we need to do to change cultural norms. That claim makes sense because the dominant discourses in their traditions and cultures would like to render some people, queer subjects, queer sexualities, undesirable, invisible. Mudisani used the possessive our in his interesting remark, "We are part of our culture." The wedding was clearly an attempt to open a door within tradition for non-conforming masculinities and sexual desire, but also destabilizing a globalized, homogeneous views of queerness as Western, as urban, as white. Robin Osmond writes of how individual choices can extend a tradition, but also how the tradition itself, tradition enriches itself from the deviation. In this way, the case manifests the prospect of how queer masculinities and men's sexualities can become tradition, and certainly can be made visible in an unlikely place like KwaTukuza today. 30 more seconds. And hence might possibly enlarge tradition. You'll have followed my argument. I'm trying to make a claim that there's work to be done here. Even if we have good laws in a country, you have to change something about this flow of life, this cultural life. Of course, the wedding of the Sithole Mudisani was singular, but not only because of what tends to be said about it. In my reading, what is most remarkable was basically the two young, gay, black South African men were claiming and testing tradition with their nuptials. In a small township in front of television cameras, they were very publicly reinscribing, yet defying several entwined gender, sexual, cultural, marital, and wedding traditions. They were conscious of their act as an attempt to make these traditions, to remake these traditions, even though they were inserting themselves into them. Whilst calling on tradition to make a space for all the people of KwaTukuza for their sexual bond, their marriage, and their identities, they were aware of the non-conformist character of the event. In some, the event and the debates on the marriage of Sitholes and Mudisani are illustrative of possibilities, of constraints and convulsions that gender and sexual practices do and can generate for and within tradition. It was in simultaneously claiming and trying to revamp tradition, in desiring tradition, in which those with authority might find them undesirable, in wanting to obey tradition, even as they challenge gender and sexual traditionalism, in involving families and in having community to bear witness that we see a disruptive and a creative potential that especially non-conforming genders and sexualities carry for tradition and its reproduction. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kopano. For saving time, we're moving straight here to Signe, so please.
Okay, thank you, Kopano. I think this example of the two young men marrying in this traditional Zulu set up is a very well chosen example to illustrate some of your points. And because they are, I know I'm just repeating some of your points, and then I'll throw the floor open. Because they are insisting on tradition in a different way. And I think that by taking up this story, you're also taking up tradition as a concept that we all work with. You can't have African studies without also having notions of tradition, and you are insisting that we go closer and see, I'm talking of myself as an African scholar, African gender scholar, go closer to this, what we mean by tradition, what do who mean by tradition. And I think you went quite a way in saying that tradition is not just tradition always changes, tradition are invented, and tradition depend on power. Tradition depend on the power of interpretation. Who have got the power of interpretation? Be the colonial officers, be the traditional chiefs, very often men. From a gender point of view, you have to be suspicious because men define tradition. This is the reason that African feminists have now taken up this challenge, claiming their right to reinterpret tradition. And if you reinterpret tradition, now I'm just talking in very general terms, but in many places, if you reinterpret so-called African culture and tradition from a gender point of view, you find out that it is not as masculine, it's not so fixed, it's not so heteronormative as you would have expected. It is very, very different, or you can find, depending on interpretation, you can find very different aspects of so-called tradition. And I think one thing that you didn't mention so much is that also this gain is not just something invented or being imported from Europe, which some of your comments also say, oh, this is all this coming with the evil colonial powers. Same-sex sexualities has been in any place, I think, back in time. It has been selected out of tradition for certain reasons, and it can be reinterpreted back into tradition, as these brave young men are doing. So I think it's a very pertinent discussion, and it was a very good case to bring it forward. And of course, much of, and another key point of yours is also, this is not just about masculinities and femininities, but about sexuality. Sexuality is a key point, and marriage. I think this is one of the first times in your production you focus on marriage. I'm very pleased because marriage is a very contested, it should be contested. Very often you take marriage for granted, anthropologists take marriage for granted, the church certainly take marriage for granted. But if you work with matrilineal societies, as I've been doing, marriage becomes a much more floating business. You can't take it for granted as such, and lots of sort of conventional gender norms are also embedded in these taken for granted notions of marriage. Anyway, so I think that since we are here, representatives claimed in the program for 36 different countries, 17 of them different African countries, I would sort of challenge you to try to, well, of course, ask questions to Kopano, but also try to rethink this type of discussions in your own context. And maybe since we are here doing African gender studies, maybe in the context of African studies also, but in the context from points of view from different African locations. So I open the floor.
Thank you.
Yes. Let me collect a few. Is there a mic there? Yeah? I particularly encourage the backbenchers, because I have I don't see fast, so, but if you, yeah. Okay, there is